right, so we are in chapter 4 of Joshua tonight. We're going to go through this chapter, and then I want to just kind of preach a very important message that everybody needs to get, that I, as a pastor, somebody who has been with many people on their last days and who's preached many funerals, there's something that I have learned from being in that situation many times I want to share with you tonight. But let's go ahead and start with verse 1, and it says, "And it came to pass, when all the people were clean passed over Jordan, that the Lord spake unto Joshua, saying, Take you 12 men out of the people, out of every tribe a man, and command ye them, saying, Take you hence out of the midst of Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, 12 stones, and ye shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where ye shall lodge this night. Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had prepared of the children of Israel, out of every tribe a man. And Joshua said unto them, Pass over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of Jordan, and take you up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel." And so this, what we're seeing right here, of course, this is after the parting of the Jordan River, one of the great miracles that God did for Israel in their history. And it was a very common practice in the Bible that whenever they would often select a man or select an individual who would do some kind of work on behalf of a large group of people. And so after they have crossed the Jordan River, Joshua tells them, every tribe select a man and have him go and grab a large stone, and we're going to make a heap of stones. We're going to make a memorial, is what they were going to do. And so whenever, though, a group selected somebody, we need to get this, okay? Whenever a group selected someone to perform a role, whatever they did, okay, and often good or bad, it was credited to the entire group. Each one, this act of setting up a memorial that they're doing here, this is something they are doing as a nation. We've always got to understand what we're seeing here. This isn't just something that's happening to a generation. This is something that God is doing for an entire nation, something that God was going to refer back to hundreds of years later, even when everybody who was actually there was dead. This was something that God did for Israel, and so they were always going to be held accountable for this because God did this great miracle for them, and if they forget about this miracle, that's their own fault, because they were commanded to set up a memorial so they would remember this, so they would remember what God did for them, and they were commanded to make sure that they pass this on to the next generation. And so they did this act where each person in each tribe got a stone. And we still do this same kind of thing today, and it's how things should be done. We were talking about this on I think 2 weeks ago on Sunday night, but whether in church government or even in our local, state, and national government, we often select people to do things on behalf of everyone. And as a pastor, I am somebody who often does things on behalf of the church. And so when I'm doing these things, it's not just me doing it, it's the church that's doing it. And I'm just an officer, performing that role. And it's the same thing too in our government. The things that our leaders are doing, they are doing on behalf of us. And that should scare you just a little bit because, there's some responsibility that we have. I don't think we like to think about that, but we are. It is just a fact. We are accountable. And the problem that we have today is we have become very disconnected from those who are in leadership in our government because of that, they've kind of become more like lords over us rather than representatives, which is what they're supposed to be. That's what our Constitution has. They are supposed to be representing us. They're supposed to be representing the will of the people. But you know what? If we went and started doing a poll today and we started going around and asking people, who is our senator? I bet a lot of people wouldn't know. Or especially on a state level, who our representatives and senators are, we have no idea. And I'm not going to beat people up too bad for that because it's just so disgusting what's going on in our government across the board. We just really don't want to, you just don't want to look. It's pretty frustrating watching the news and just seeing the things that are going on. And it's real easy to feel very helpless when it comes to a lot of these things. But at the end of the day, hey, if you've decided, I just want to be disconnected, I don't want to know, I don't want to vote, I don't want to have anything to do with it, I'm not going to beat you up and demand that you have to, pick the lesser of two evils, otherwise you're going to, be accountable to God. But at the same, I'm not going to say all the Fox News Baptist talking points, but I will say this. We can disconnect ourselves all that we want, but we will not necessarily be immune from the problems that these people cause. So, you know what? Don't be too hard on the guy who maybe wants to get a little more involved than we do. And I mean, I'm just going to be honest, I'm not very involved myself. Don't quiz me on who all our leaders are in a lot of things. I'm not real sure how I would do on it. I think I do better than most, but probably not real good. But either way, this is just one of those areas where, if people are a little less involved than you, be a little understanding of that. I can see why they're frustrated. If they're a little more involved than you, leave them alone. They don't love the government more than God and all the straw man things people throw at them. Just leave people alone. Let them do their thing. All right. If you feel led to go, get involved in these things, I hope you succeed, assuming you have conservative values. But this message tonight is not about how to fix those problems, but I am just kind of showing you what the problem is right now. And that is, the people who are representing us are more like just lords over us. And we're so ignorant today, we've got people that will literally use the verse, honor the king, when we have elected representatives violating the Constitution, and then act like we should just follow them. All I have to say to you is, if that's what you think. I mean, you're nuts. if that's how you're going to interpret that verse and apply it in today's situation. And that's another sermon I'd love to preach, but not tonight. That's not what Joshua 4 is all about. So verse 6 says, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean ye by these stones? Then ye shall answer them, that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. So what took place that day, it was not just about that generation. It was not about the individuals who crossed over. It was about what God did for Israel as a nation, and all the future generations were to recognize this event as something that God had done for them. And so God tells them, make a memorial. God says, set up these 12 stones, and I don't know how they set them up exactly. I don't know what it looked like. I don't know if they stacked them. I don't know how big it was. It said, take up a stone upon your shoulder, so it couldn't have been that big of a stone if just one guy's going and able to carry it. But either way, these stones were set up in a way where it wasn't a natural thing. And, the hope was that future generations are going to come along and see that pile of stones there and ask their mom and dad, what are these stones all about? And then they were supposed to say, this was a spot where our fathers crossed over. God opened the waters right here. God parted the waters so we could come over here because God wanted to give us this land. God wanted to protect us. God wanted to give us a law, and God wanted us to love Him and serve Him. God wanted to fellowship with us. He wanted to put His tabernacle in the midst of us. God wanted to do all these things for us, and it was a reminder. And think about it. If they would have done this, what a great reminder that is too for these future generations in case they decide, you know what, we don't like God's law. But wait a minute, God didn't part a river for us so we could just come over here and do our own thing. If we want to go and do what the other nations do, we should probably go back on the other side of that river where the heathen. Like, remember what Joshua said later in chapter 24, and if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served were on the other side of the flood, or the God of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. He said, what, if that's what you want to serve, go serve them. Go to the other side of the river. But those stones were a memorial, and memorials are a good thing. And I believe it's 100% appropriate for a nation to have memorials. But I do believe in our nation, and I think many nations do this, but I know in ours, we often cross a line and create idols. Okay, I am thankful for a lot of the memorials and things we have to remember things in our history. Just recently I got to go to Independence Hall. That was pretty cool, going where they signed the Declaration of Independence, and we didn't get to go in that part this time, but we got to go in the part where John Adams was inaugurated, and they're telling the story about how exciting it was the first time they had a peaceful transition of power. They'd never seen anything like that before. They were used to kings and bloodshed anytime things changed hands. And they told the whole story, after John Adams' inauguration, as they started to walk out, and when they opened the doors and it was John Adams kind of leading and he was the new president, they said people were just crying, and because it cemented it in their minds, then it confirmed that the Constitution is the law of the land. It's not about a man anymore. George Washington, while still living, literally has stepped aside, and we're letting a new guy take over. We're used to that kind of thing today. We're used to that. I mean, our country threw a hissy fit when some nut jobs, ran on the Capitol this time. But you know what? That kind of thing used to be common, except with way more bloodshed. Way more bloodshed. That was the worst revolution that ever happened. We've all been waiting for the revolution. Man, that one stunk. Let's not even talk about that. But anyway, it's neat going back and talking about those things and reminding us of those things. And it was interesting for me as we went back there, and as they talked about that, and they were talking about certain things that are just are expected today in this country that were radical ideas back then. For example, like freedom of the press. They were talking about Benjamin Franklin's brother. I think he did time. He did time for writing an article in a paper against the king. I mean, look at the way we bash our leaders today. And I'm thankful we're able to do that. I'm glad it's not like that, but that was in America where that kind of thing happened. And so those memorials we have, it reminds us of some of the things that we have today that are precious, that actually make us a little bit thankful for this country. Now, they're trying to ruin that too, because also, before you go to the Liberty Bell, which is right outside of Independence Hall, they've added this whole big thing for the homos, and about how basically apologizing for how we treated them historically. And it's just like, they have to ruin everything with that. And they do the same thing in D.C. That's absolutely disgusting. I don't want to get sidetracked on that either. But we do need memorials. And the memorials we have today, though, in America, they are often idolatrous because, for example, there are graven images, okay? And I get it. Lincoln Memorial, I saw the Lincoln Memorial recently, the Jefferson Memorial. Those places are pretty cool. And it's really, and you could go and say, well, you know what? God said to make memorials in the Bible. Yeah, but he also said not to make graven images. And so if we want to make a memorial, something to remember, things in history, that's fine. But I think we go too far when we do the graven images. And in Washington, D.C., even things that aren't necessarily graven images, what is it that we're all amazed at when we go to places like D.C.? It's the architecture. But the memorials they did in the Bible, they were actually very simple. It was 12 rocks. There's a big difference between 12 rocks and the Washington Monument, okay? There's some big differences there. And when we look at things like the Washington Monument, it doesn't necessarily get us talking about history. We're just kind of in awe of the architecture. And I think we'd be better off if we did things that were a little more simple. If you go to places like Gettysburg, pretty much what you have there is just like an open field, from what I understand. I've never been there, but there's a place like that, and they might have a plaque or something up, and where with the writing that tells you about things that happened there. I think that's appropriate. I think that's good. I think we should remember those things. And so, I don't want to talk a whole lot about that. I preached a message last year on the importance of memorials, and I believe I used this chapter. You can go back and refer to that, but I want to focus on a different kind of memorial later in this message. But verse 8, it says, "And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, and he took up the 12 stones out of the midst of Jordan, as the Lord spake unto Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, and carried them over with them unto the place where they lodged, and laid them down there. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bare the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there unto this day. Okay, now for those of you that think the Bible's a magical book, when we read there unto this day, that doesn't necessarily mean we can find them to this day, but in the day whenever Joshua was written. Okay, so, I don't know if they've ever found that spot. I doubt those stones are still there to this day, but it'd be cool if they were, if they could find them, but that's an important thing to make note of. So when something of that kind of significance takes place, I do think you should do something to remember it, and it is a great thing to take future generations and take them back and to the spot and talk about what happened there. And, one of the things that, hopefully some of you will do, especially if you were a part of the church was over on 9th Avenue, years from now, you drive by there. I remember we used to go to church over there, and then you start telling stories. I went and drove by there today just to see what was going on, with the place. And, when I was a kid, my dad would constantly, whenever we'd be visiting different towns, take us down memory lane and drive by churches that he used to go to. My dad used to live in Decatur, and Aaron, you guys are from there. But I remember the last time we went there, we went to go pick up something, and so we were there. And so you can't go to Decatur without my dad driving you around and showing you the places that he lived. And we stopped by this church that he pastored for a short time, and there were people there, and we went and talked to him. And then they took us in this one room, and they had like a wall there that had all the previous pastors of there, and they had this hilarious picture of my dad, where my dad thought he was still kind of at that age where he thought he was Elvis a little bit, and you'd have to see the picture and know my dad. But I remember we were kind of cracking up when we saw that, and he was real young. Wasn't even married or anything yet, and and my dad will be the first one to tell you, I don't know why they made me pastor there, but they did. They hadn't heard all the sermons that you all have about qualification of a bishop and all that kind of stuff. But either way, Lord blessed and used them. But that's a good thing. If I drive through Spring Valley with my family, and I've done it before, it's been a long time, I'll show them the church I used to go to. And it's the church I got baptized. It's some kind of charismatic church now, but I've got great memories of that. It's a memorial. It's something we can remember and talk about. These are good things for us to do. And so verse 10 says, "And for the priests which bear the ark stood in the midst of Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to speak unto the people according to all that Moses commanded Joshua. And the people hasted and passed over. And it came to pass, when all the people were clean passed over, that the ark of the Lord passed over, and the priests in the presence of the people. And the children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the children of Israel, as Moses spake unto them." And it specifically mentions them because they were the ones that had settled on the other side of Jordan. But Moses had commanded them, you cross over Jordan, and you help your brothers drive out the Canaanites, and then you can go back. So they are being obedient here, doing exactly what Moses told them to do. So it says, "And about 40,000 prepared for war passed over before the Lord unto battle to the plains of Jericho. On that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life." And this is important too. It was God that exalted Joshua. Joshua did not exalt himself. Joshua was appointed the leader, but Joshua didn't have to walk around beating his chest saying, I am the leader, and throwing spears to anybody who questioned him. Okay? God exalted him, and everybody was scared of him, just like God had done with Moses. I think it was cooler what God did with Moses. When Moses' authority was challenged by Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, you know what God did? You know what? Moses, he was a meek man. Moses, he didn't beat his chest either. But you know what? God got upset. And God said, you know what? Fine, I'll show you who's in charge. And then God opened up the ground and swallowed up the other guys and then closed it back up. That is just another awesome story. I wouldn't have messed with Moses after that. I promise you I wouldn't have. And so, and God did that for Moses. And you know what? It's going to be God that it's God that exalts leaders. Great leaders, they don't have to use, crazy manipulative methods like we talked about on Sunday night. They don't have to use intimidation. They don't have to threaten. They don't have to do that kind of thing. great leaders are just people who others choose to follow because they have proven themselves. They have shown that the Holy Spirit is with them and that they are doing the work of the Lord, and good people are going to want to follow people like that. And you know what? If a leader has to constantly threaten people and scream about how he's a boss, that's a bad sign. Just like as a husband, if you have to constantly remind your wife that, you know what, I'm the head of this house, that means there's some question for some reason. And maybe it's being questioned because you're just not leading. And that's the case a lot of times. Husbands are just lazy. They don't want to make any decisions. They don't want to do anything. Or maybe you're just a really bad leader. But, good leaders, if they get called into question, if they're in the right, God will exalt them. God will show who is right. That's always a very important thing that we see, and it's something we see God do all the time. But verse 15 says, "And the Lord spake unto Joshua, saying, Command the priests that bear the ark of the testimony, that they come up out of Jordan. Joshua therefore commanded the priests, saying, Come ye up out of Jordan. And it came to pass, when the priests that bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord were come up out of the midst of Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up unto the dry land, that the waters of Jordan returned unto their place, and flowed over all his banks, as they did before. And the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and encamped in Gilgal in the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal, and spake unto the children of Israel, saying, When your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean these stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you, until you were passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, when he dried up from before us, until we were gone over, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord that is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever." So God wanted them talking about this. And boy, I don't know how you wouldn't talk about something like that. Just imagine seeing waters part to begin with. But then, when you watch these priests holding the Ark of the Covenant standing in the midst of that, and then as soon as they get out and are on dry land, the waters start flowing again. There's no doubt at that point. There's really no doubt. And I'm just so thankful, because you get so frustrated at Israel's, lack of faith and lack of belief. But this generation that crossed the Jordan River, they did good. They weren't perfect. They made mistakes. We'll see some of that. But this generation was a great generation that served the Lord. It's just like, thank you. At least we had one generation that did a good job, that actually showed some faith. And you say, well, there's no way they wouldn't show faith after all that they saw. You know what? They still had faith, because guess what? There was the generation before them saw the Red Sea part, and yet they still didn't have any faith. So these people still had faith. Everyone's required to have faith. And thankfully, we do have one good example, one good generation. And so now that we've gone through the chapter, though, again, a year ago, I preached that message on the importance of memorials. And so I don't want to cover the same things I did in that message, but I want to cover something I think is very important for our own personal lives and for our family. I think this is something, I know this is something that is lacking big time in families. I know this from experience as a pastor who has, who I have preached many funerals, and especially too, I've seen this when it comes to preaching funerals of people that I didn't know. And even just not that long ago, I preached a funeral of someone that I didn't know. And whenever I'm going to preach a funeral of someone that I don't know, usually it's because I know somebody in the family and they ask me to do it. But I'll go talking to the family, and I like to find out if they were a believer or not. And many times, you go and you ask the family about it, and they really don't know. They don't know hardly anything about it. And a lot of times, too, you'll find out they were religious, that they went to church, and I'm always glad to at least hear they were a part of a church or something like that. But, nobody in the family knows their salvation testimony. Nobody knows hardly. It's amazing how little we know about our own family history today. It's kind of sad. Again, not only have we become disconnected from our leaders and everything, we've become very disconnected from our families. And people know very little. And I think that it's important that we remember some things and that we make some memorials in our family. Okay? And how you do this, I don't think it's necessarily going to work setting up stones or anything like that. But I want to talk about some memorials I think we need to have as families. And the first thing, I think you need to make a memorial out of where and when you got saved. Okay? And turn over to Acts chapter 26. I think, talking about your salvation when you got saved is very important, okay? And listen, sometimes we get critical of giving a testimony because you have people who soul win that way. Don't go soul winning that way, okay? You don't need to tell your story when you go soul winning. Tell Jesus' story when you go soul winning. But in your family, you should tell your story. I think this is a very important thing, and I think there's an appropriate time to tell your story. There's going to be times when it's relevant. In fact, I think it's a good thing to do in church every once in a while. In fact, we used to do that back in the olden days in our church more. We probably should do that more often, where we just take time and people tell their salvation testimony and share with people in the church when they got saved. This is an important thing to talk about and an important thing to remember. And the Apostle Paul, this was something he did. We see in Acts chapter 26 in verse 12, it says, "Whereupon, as I went to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priest, at midday, O king, I saw on the way a light from heaven above the brightness of the sun, shining round about me, and then them which journeyed with me. And when we were all fallen to the earth, I heard a voice speaking unto me and saying in the Hebrew tongue, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And I said, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. And we're not going to go read that whole thing. But basically, we see Paul, he's sharing his testimony. And you know what? We should share our testimony with other people. We should let other people know about when we got saved. And I don't think you necessarily need to build something. Okay? You don't have to necessarily build something. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with writing it down. I think it would be a good thing, to write down when you got saved, where you got saved. Write the date down if you know the date of when you got saved. But I believe it is so important that your family knows your testimony. And understand too, if you have young kids, you can tell them about it now. But, a lot of times little kids, they don't remember a lot of those things. And there may come a day in the future where that will be very important to them too. And here's another, there's so many reasons I could think of, okay? But here's another reason you should do something to, cement the story of your salvation in the minds of your family. And that is because, I know we don't want to plan for these things, but what if you get backslidden? Think about this. What if you get backslidden today? Your kids are here, they're young, they're saved, or maybe they're young enough they haven't even been saved yet. But let's say you get backslidden. And 30 years from now, you die, and then your kids get saved. If you weren't living like a Christian during most of their life, and then you die, they're going to wonder. They're not going to know. And that's something that's probably going to bother them. But, the truth is, if you were saved, just because you got backslidden, you didn't lose your salvation, you were saved, that would be a very comforting thing for your kids someday. Even if you're backslidden, because in case, they end up coming back to God, that would be, how valuable that would be for your kids? I've talked to people before. In fact, I remember Hazel, okay, when Hazel started coming to the church. She was coming to the church all the time, but she had never been saved. She made no claims to be saved. It was Beulah that told me that she wasn't saved. And they'd been coming for a long time, and I just kind of assumed she was. I figured we stole her out of another church or something. And so I went over and visited one time, and I asked her about it, and she was like, I've never been saved. And I'm like, well then, why do you come to the church? She's like, because you asked me. I'm like, I'm like, and so, I told her, I was like, well, you really need to get saved, and so I went through everything with her, and she didn't want to get saved just yet, and so I told her, I was like, well, I'm not going to pressure you. I said, but I'd really like to see you get saved. And I said, I'm going to come back in a little while. We'll talk about it again. And so probably about a month later, I talked to her again, and I asked her, I said, hey, have you thought about it? She's like, I have. I've thought about it. And she said, my mom and dad, as far as I know, they never got saved. And I said, I think they're probably in hell, and I think that's where I deserve to go too. And I told her, I said, you do deserve to go to hell. Everybody deserves to go to hell, but you don't want to, do you? And because I told her, I went to the story of the rich man. I said, because here's the thing. I said, if your parents are in hell, they don't want you to go there. And I told her too, I said, what if your parents got saved when they were younger? And I showed how you can never lose your salvation. Just because they weren't religious and you don't know their testimony or anything like that, doesn't mean that they're not in heaven right now. So either way, if they're in heaven, if they're in hell, they want you to go to heaven. And thankfully, she still didn't get saved then, but it was a few weeks later, she came to me after church and she's like, Pastor, I'm ready to get saved. And she ended up getting saved and got baptized, and that was exciting to see that. But you know what? I mean, and thankfully, has a happy ending. She still got saved. But what if she would have had something from her parents that they had written down, that gave their salvation testimony? Like I said, I don't know that they ever were saved or not. But you know what? That would have just encouraged her even more when she's, that this is my parents' legacy. This is their history. Because it was like she wanted to be loyal to her family. And said if they were saved, they didn't pass that on in any way. And it could have stopped that. Thankfully, the Lord intervened. She got saved anyway. But I'm telling you, that's going to be a very valuable thing. It will be a very comforting thing if someday you get backslidden. And if they had something that, that you had written down that gave your testimony about when you got saved, or better yet, if they remembered hearing you talk about it, what a wonderful thing that would be. My dad, too, when we were, like I said, anytime we go through places he used to live, we'd always go down memory lane. Granite City was another place that he lived in. We could not ever go anywhere near Granite City without visiting Granite City and then going down memory lane and seeing all the places that my dad lived. And I remember one day we went and stopped by the church where he got saved. West 22nd Street Baptist Church. I know, because my dad was a pastor too, so he gave his testimony all the time. And let me tell you, I know my dad's testimony frontwards and backwards. But because I heard him talk about it in church all the time. But not only that, when I think about my dad's story, not only can I tell the story myself, but I can also picture it in my head, because my dad literally took me to the place where he got saved, and he showed me, this is where I was sitting in the service that night. This is where I went forward, and he tells the story about how he went forward during the altar call, but the pastor didn't notice him when he came up there. And my dad just kind of got embarrassed. He was 9 or 10 years old at the time, and he just kind of went back to his seat. Well, the assistant pastor had noticed it, and so after church, he said something to the pastor, and so the pastor came and talked to him, and he mentioned how he wanted to get saved, and then he showed me the spot, talked about how his parents were sitting right there. He went through the whole story. I can see it all in my head. And you say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, you know what? One of these days, when I'm at my dad's funeral, that story is going to really mean a lot to me. Because it's going to be a reminder to me that while we're about to put my dad in the ground, I know I'm going to see him again. Because not just because he claims it, but I know all about that. And that's going to be a blessing to me. I remember when I was a child, I was a teenager at the time, and we were sitting outside our house in Troy Grove. I think we made a campfire that evening. We were sitting out there with my sisters and my grandma and grandpa on my mom's side, and we just started asking all these family questions, and they started giving all their family history and just telling us who everybody was and telling us about our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents, the things they remembered about it, and then and then we were getting salvation testimonies. They were like talking about when they got saved And I mean, those are valuable memories for me. And you know what? It meant a lot to me when I went to my grandma and grandpa's funeral. My grandma and grandpa's funeral, my grandpa's funeral especially, it was one of the happiest services you could ever go to. Because my grandpa, he lived a good long life. He was ready to go. When we went and visited him in the hospital not long before he died, he sat there talking just normal and just making his, everybody's making funeral plans right there in front of him. He didn't care. They brought up something that was coming up in a few months, and he's like, well, yeah, I won't be able to be there. I'm going to be in heaven. And he's not even acting spiritual. That's just how he was. He was just kind of a matter-of-fact guy, and he knew he was just about done, and he was okay with it. And, we went and said goodbye, and but it wasn't really goodbye. It was a see you later. And then he died, and we went to the funeral, and we were sad because we're going to miss him, but he was getting old, he had a lot of health problems, and he was ready to go. Grandma was already there. It was more sad when Grandma died because now Grandpa was alone. But I mean, it was as much as I love my grandparents, I am so thankful that he had a solid testimony, that his not just his testimony, but his life was a memorial. So when I went to his funeral, I'm able to sit there and be joyful. I'm able to be joyful knowing that his suffering's done, and while I'm going to miss him, this is temporary. I mean, boy, every person should give that to their children and their grandchildren, that hope that only a Christian can have. But boy, if you're one of these people, you're not sharing these things. And listen, you might have family members right now that aren't saved. But what if they get saved down the road? I mean, it will be such a blessing to them to know and to find out that, my dad or my grandpa was saved. And, I only heard the testimonies of my grandparents. I don't know the testimonies of all my great-grandparents. But I like to think that, I come from a long line of saved people. I don't know that, but I'd like to think that. I do know I do know my grandpa McMurtry was saved. The one before him, I don't know, but I wish I did know. I wish if he was saved, somebody would have wrote it down. And you know what? Even when it comes to my grandpa, thankfully I know his testimony verbally because I've heard my dad tell that story. But these things are all valuable. And you know what? If we want Christianity to be a part of our family and a part of, and to be in our ancestry, okay, the farther back your ancestor goes, the bigger of a deal he is in your mind, isn't he? And wouldn't it be something if, future generations had something of yours that they could look at to know about you, and one of the main things they were able to see is this person was a follower of Jesus Christ, a believer in Jesus Christ. It had your salvation testimony. We would all be very interested if we could find some writing of one of our ancestors going back 5 or 6 generations. We would all be interested in whatever it was. And if it had something like that, what an impact that would make. And so I think we need to do things like this. And so just sharing the story, it creates a memorial in their minds. And so we need to make sure we remind ourselves of when we got saved. Turn over to 2 Peter. Let me show you this right here in 2 Peter. In chapter 1, in verse 5, it says, "And beside this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, brotherly kindness charity. For if these things be in you and abound, they make you that you shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. But he that lacketh these things is blind and cannot see afar off, and hath forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. Wherefore the rather, brethren, give diligence to make your calling and election sure, for if ye do these things, ye shall never fall." And so just you sharing your story, it creates a memorial in your mind, and it reminds you of where you came from. Because a lot of people, I think they do forget. Many people forget. I think that's one of the reasons, too, when we're out soul winning, we often ask people, hey, if you die today, do you know for sure you're going to go to heaven? And then they'll say, yeah, yes, or I think so. And then they'll give some answers that aren't necessarily right. But then you start going through the gospel with them, and they're like, all of a sudden, it's like, yeah, you know what? I do believe that. I've done that before. And often we're like, well, why'd they give the wrong answers? Well, you know what? You go 20 years, 30 years, never giving your testimony, and you know what? You're probably going to get a little stumped and stumble around and say some wrong things when somebody comes and asks you these questions. It's easy for us because, as a soul winner, you're reminded of these things all the time. I mean, every week when you're out giving the gospel, it's going to make it really hard to forget you were purged from your old sins. But you know what? A lot of people never go soul winning. They never talk about these things. And there's going to be times too. Again, my testimony is not in my presentation. But sometimes, depending on questions and things that are asked, it will come up. It will come up every once in a while. And I think we need these reminders. And so, whatever it takes, whether it's you just writing these things down, whether it's you just verbally telling your kids about it, taking them to the place. I've got a picture somewhere. I don't even know where it is. I remember, but I have a picture that I took of the place where I got saved. I went back to that house years later. I used to give guitar lessons to the son of the pastor who was living there. It was a parsonage. And I remember, I'd always, when you go into the house, to the right there was the bedroom where I got saved. And I remember I asked one time if I could go in there and just get a picture. I wanted a picture of the place where I got saved. Why? It's a reminder. It's not about the place, but it is about the reminder. And it's something I can go back, and it's a memorial for me. And it's something I can show my kids when we're going through old pictures. Hey, Dad, what's this random picture of you standing in a room? Hey, that's where I got saved. And my dad's got a picture. When we went back there, he took a picture of the place he got saved. These are our memorials. And so, make memorials out of when you got saved. Make memorials out of your family history, especially if they are saved. It says in Exodus 3:13, and Moses said unto God, behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and they shall say unto them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, that they shall say it to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am, hath sent me unto you. And God said, moreover, unto Moses, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, the Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, hath sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. You know what God told Moses to tell them? He said, when you go to talk to them, you tell them, I'm the God of their ancestors, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am the God of your fathers. And that's something, too, that it was going to have an impact. Okay, he's talking about the God, because they all revere, we all revere our fathers if we know who they are. And they knew who Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was. And so God was that memorial, and he gives them his name as a memorial. God wanted Moses to remind them of where they came from, the God that their father served. And if you have a good family history, share that. Let your children know about that. Remember these things. It's very important. We need to remember the good, and you know what? We need to remember the bad too. We need to remember the bad or the good to motivate us to do the same, but then we need to remember the bad to make sure we don't make the same mistakes. In Nehemiah 13, verse 17, it says, then I contended with the nobles of Judah and said unto them, what evil thing is this that ye do and profane the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers thus? And did not our God bring all this evil upon us, upon the city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. They had just come out of captivity. They hadn't even been out of captivity that long. They had been in captivity for 70 years because they did not let the land rest for 70 years. Those were Sabbath years where they were supposed to let the land rest. They profaned the Sabbath, and so they had went into captivity. And here they are, this new generation that's come out of captivity, and they're profaning the Sabbath. And Nehemiah's like, don't you remember what your fathers did? This is why the previous generation suffered, and yet you're doing the same thing. All you're going to do is bring more wrath upon us. And if you have a bad history, then you know what you do? You remember that so you don't do the same thing. And, not because not everybody has that, good heritage. But you know what? You can start one. And at this time, during Moses' time, they had a good heritage, even though that generation stunk. And they used that to call these people to action. During Nehemiah's time, they had a really bad heritage, but he used that to motivate them to start over and to do something right. And so if you have a bad heritage, you know what? You can start a good one. And let me tell you something, especially if you're a first-generation Christian, you know what? It'd be pretty cool if, years from now, when your family history is looking back, they knew your story about how you came from a rough background, how you came from a lost family or a Catholic family or whatever. Maybe you're into all kinds of idolatry or something like, some crazy religion, and then they knew that story of that first one who got saved and just became a faithful soul winner, raised a family in church, was the only one in all his family that lived that way, but yet started a whole new generation. And then your children do the same thing, and years from now they're still talking about that. I mean, that's what you have the potential to start. If one, you'll live for the Lord, but two, you got to memorialize these things. You got to do something to make sure these things get passed down. And I don't know exactly how all you can do that, but I'd come up with something. I'd come up with something. Today we have cameras. We can make video. Just make a video telling your story. You know how valuable that will be? And I've got more points. I'm going to quit with this. I was going to talk about church memorials and things. We're not even going to go into that. But I'll give you one more story of a memorial that was just, an unbelievable blessing to my dad. There was an evangelist, Jack Parchment, that was very influential in my dad's life, very influential in my life. He was very special to us. And I remember when it was like a year or two, I think it was well over a year, maybe 2 years before the 20th anniversary of Lighthouse Baptist Church. And one of the men in my dad's church, he got this idea of when we had the 20th anniversary, having a video of a bunch of different preachers just kind of congratulating Dad. And so he secretly was going to started talking to some of these preachers so he could video them, just kind of giving a message for Dad because he wanted to surprise him with his video. And he ended up videoing Jack Parchment. And Jack Parchment, he kind of tells the story about how he met my dad. And I'm not even going to go into that story, but it was a cool story when where he just really encouraged my dad as a young preacher when somebody tried to discourage him, and it always meant a lot to my dad. And I remember, but he told that story in there, congratulating him and everything, but he ended up dying, before the 20th anniversary. And he would have been one of the speakers of that meeting for sure if he'd still been alive, but he died before we had the 20th anniversary. And I remember we had a special night. We're going to watch a video that my dad had put together over the last 20 years, but before we did it, we told my dad, we've got a video we want to show you. And there was Brother Parchment on there, and my dad, man, he just lost it. He just lost it when he saw that. But man, he sat there and he told that story and just gave that testimony, and it meant so much to everyone. We don't take the time to do those things these days. And I'm telling you, I have been at so many funerals where the family, they just don't, it's amazing how little they know about their family. It's amazing how little some wives know about their husband and how little some children know about their parents. And if you have something in your life that's very important to you, like the gospel, like Jesus Christ, hey, do you really want to depend on the next generation to give your kids the gospel? What if you made some kind of video, some kind of memorial that you just made a tradition? Hey, you make sure everybody says, yeah, I've never done anything like this. I probably should do something like that too. You know, something special I make. You know what? I sure hope all of my kids get all of my grandkids saved. But you know what? Maybe I shouldn't just depend on them to get it done. Maybe I should do something about it. Maybe I should make some kind of video like that, telling my grandkids about the God of their grandfather and of their great-grandfather and of their great-great-grandfather. Tell the stories that I know. Because chances are, you know, my kids aren't going to remember the stories of my grandparents. And I believe that kind of thing can have an impact. I think we need to do that kind of thing. I would love to just have the written testimony of my great-grandfather. That would mean so much to me. And I really think we could have a real impact if we would do more of this. We see him doing that kind of thing in the Bible, but for some reason we don't think about that stuff today. And listen, another reason you need to do that, it will help me out someday if I preach your funeral. You know, because I'm not going to remember everybody's testimonies and all that, and I don't want to have to go no, I'd like to be able to get up and tell your story when I do your funeral about when you got saved. And it will mean something to a lot of people. And I think we take that for granted. So family memorials, think about those things and do something in your family to help them remember these things. So with that, let's pray. Dear Lord, I pray that this message will have an impact. I pray all of us, Lord, myself included. Oh, Lord, I got convicted even just thinking about this stuff and preparing for this message. Or we don't do enough to remember the things that you have done for us and to pass those things on to future generations. And so I pray this message will inspire everyone to do this. And Lord, I do. Lord, if your coming doesn't come for many more years, I want every one of my descendants to be saved. And so I pray that I'll do my part to make sure that happens. And I pray that we'll all take these things serious. In your name we pray. Amen.